thank you all for coming. And thank you, Rick, since now I don't have to talk about what's happening today. There are 2 seats in front, by the way, if anyone would like to sit down. I wonder how Caleb Strong and Christopher Gore, George Clinton and Daniel D. Tompkins feel about Elbridge Gerry's long and continued hold in a small way on the American imagination. Unlike those 4 gentlemen, his name lives on, and they are all forgotten. As forgotten as he is, aside from the gerrymander. And again, it seems that the popular parlance is to call it a gerrymander. We know his name was Gerry. But think about this. He is best known for something about which he had very little to do. And just to tell you why this happened in January of 1812, when the legislature, as Rick said, was redistricting in the wake of the 1810 census, Massachusetts at that time still was one of the most federalist states in the Union, Massachusetts and Connecticut. It had an insurgent or a rising Republican population, Republican in the sense of the party of Jefferson. The Federalists were the party of Hamilton and Adams. And the Massachusetts State Senate still had a very strong Federalist majority. And of all of Massachusetts, the most Federalist district was Essex County. In fact, in Essex County, there was a fairly powerful group of individuals that President Adams called the Essex Junto. Junto typically, like gerrymander, is typically a word we don't think of kindly. And typically, we don't like gerrymandering when it happens against us. So say it's a universally loathed thing, doesn't explain why whenever we, being people who want power, have an opportunity, we will use it. But the legislature redrew the Essex County district, which typically elected 5 Federalists to the state Senate. And they drew it like this, putting Marblehead and Salem into their own small district, dividing up the rest. I suppose we could look at this as I don't know if this is cracking or stacking or packing that's happening in Essex County, but the new map is drawn to divide Essex County up into 5 districts, which would elect ultimately 3 Republicans, 2 Federalists. So this really worked. And this map was produced in January of 1812, actually at a dinner party at the home of Israel Thorndike in Boston, and without the wings and the claws. And an artist named Elkanah Tisdale drew the wings, the ferocious mouth and the claws, and held it up and said, "It's good enough for a salamander." And someone said, "More like a gerrymander." And that's the name that stuck, the gerrymander, after this attempt. Now, it works, though, as a partisan tool. The state Senate in 1812 elected 29 Republicans, 11 Federalists. The vote in Massachusetts was 51,000 for the Federalists, 50,000 for the Republicans. So very evenly divided, and yet the Republicans get a majority in the state Senate. And it doesn't work for Governor Gerry, who is voted out of office. 51,000 to 50,000, it's a pretty even margin. So Gerry loses his seat over this, but his name lives on. And you can see some of the commentary at the time. His Excellency, we're naming it for him. He's known to be a zealous patron and promoter of whatever is new, astonishing, and erratic, especially of domestic growth and manufacture. The monster shall be denominated a gerrymander, in a name that must exceedingly gratify the parental bosom of our worthy chief magistrate. This person really didn't like Governor Gerry, and over the course of his life, he did make a lot of enemies. And through his long life, he actually had been one of the most involved citizens of Massachusetts. So it's ironic that this name is what we remember him for. And sometimes if you read the superficial commentary of people who want to blast gerrymandering, they'll talk about Elbridge Gerry, this political operator. but from his youth in Marblehead. Here he was, I know probably I could ask any of you to stand up and tell me a bit about Elbridge Gerry, and you could tell me about his childhood, his youth here. So it's always with some trepidation that I come to a place to talk about the local hero, or one of the local heroes. And Marblehead, I know, has many. His father, Thomas, had come here as a ship's master from England, married. Anyone know Gerry's mother's name? Oh, that's reassuring. Elizabeth Greenleaf. Her father was a Boston merchant, and he was the third of their 12 children. And he does go to Harvard, and then he joins his father and his two brothers in the family business, which was shipping codfish. Here he is in 1798. Shipping codfish from Marblehead to, this is Marblehead Harbor in 1763, off to Bilbao, Spain, as well as to Barbados. And in Spain, Gerry's chief contact was Diego de Gardoqui. And the Gardoquis were a mercantile family in Bilbao. Bilbao is in the Basque country of Spain. And this connection with Bilbao is going to be extraordinarily important during the Revolution, because the Gardoquis are going to supply the Continental Army and the nascent Navy at a time when Spain doesn't recognize American independence. It's similar to the arrangement made in France, setting up a dummy corporation, but in this case, Bilbao is shipping things to Marblehead secretly through the house of Gardoqui, and Diego Gardoqui becomes the first Spanish consul in America. And Gerry in 1772 is elected to the General Court, where he quickly comes under the spell or the wing of Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams, one of the leading patriots, who at this time is creating committees of correspondence and otherwise organizing resistance to the encroaching power of Governor Hutchinson and his cabal. And so Gerry is part of the Committee of Correspondence here in Marblehead. His father actually chairs it. And Adams, at the end of 1772, sends a circular letter to all of the towns in Massachusetts advising what to do about Governor Hutchinson and his various schemes. And Gerry writes the response of Marblehead, which is one of the most vociferous of any of the towns of Massachusetts, standing with the patriots of Boston. Elbridge and his brothers are on this committee, and however, in January of 1774, the Gerrys resign from the local committee of correspondence, because they're really angry about something that the people of Marblehead do to them. And that is, the Gerrys were responsible, along with John Glover and his brother Jonathan, for building a smallpox hospital on what then was Cat Island, today is Children's Island, off of Marblehead. There was a smallpox outbreak in Marblehead. They built a hospital so those who had contracted the disease. Smallpox, as you probably know, was the most devastating illness in the history of the human race. Something like 30% of the people who contracted it would die. And it was something of a mysterious virus. They didn't know it was a virus-borne illness then. But putting a hospital out on Cat Island seemed to be a way of spreading the infection to those who were not as well versed as we are, and no one at the time was, in the spread of infection. So in January of 1774, a mob ventures, or 1773, a mob ventures out into Cat Island and burns the smallpox hospital down. There had been another group actually had gone out there to try to steal the clothing that was there and bring it into town. You can imagine they want to sell this clothing that they had stolen from a smallpox hospital. We could immediately see that's going to be a bad idea. But they thought, oh, here's an opportunity since these people aren't really watching their clothes. And in January of 1774, as I said, a mob burns the hospital down. And what really annoyed the Gerrys was no one responsible was punished for it. Some people were brought to trial, but there's not a jury in Essex County that is going to find against these upstanding citizens who had taken it upon themselves to burn down the smallpox hospital. So Gerry resigns. He had a temper about things like this, and he didn't want to be governed by a mob. He feared the mob as much as he distrusted people, the coterie with wealth and power. He was really distrustful of both. So, Gerry's resign. However, later in the year, as the crisis with Great Britain increases, this is actually the flag of the smallpox hospital, Gerry and his brothers return into public life, accepting an election to the provincial Congress. And as Boston is shut down in 1774 in the wake of the Boston Tea Party, the Gerrys here in Marblehead are importing goods to supply the people of Boston who have been cut off. In June of 1774, the British government had shut down Boston Harbor. So where are goods going to come from for Bostonians? Well, they come from Marblehead, thanks to the Gerrys. And he is elected to the Essex County Convention and then to the Provincial Congress, the body that takes the place of the Assembly, which had been suspended. And this puts him, the Assembly, or the Provincial Congress, puts him on the Committee of Safety. This is the group that's responsible for protecting the safety of people, as we have a British Army now occupying Boston and looking for ways to disarm the citizens in the rest of the province. In February of 1775, as you probably know, Captain Leslie comes to Salem to try to get the weapons that are being stockpiled there, and the folks in Salem prevent him from getting them. And we have the provincial, ministerial army doing other forays into the countryside to try to seize weapons. Gerry happens to be at a meeting of the Committee of Safety in Menotomy in April of 1775, actually on the 18th of April. And he and Jeremiah Lee are in the inn in Menotomy, and suddenly they hear British troops outside. The British are on their way to Lexington and actually they're on their way to Concord to get the weapons being stockpiled there. Gerry and Lee flee into the night. Gerry hides out in the cornfield. Lee actually breaks his ankle getting out of the inn, and it's an accident that hastens his own demise just shortly after this. All Gerry loses in this encounter were his big overcoat that he left behind, as well as his watch. The British search the inn. They don't find Gerry or Lee, but they do find Gerry's coat and his watch. And he is involved now, having been there as the hostilities begin in April of 1775. And then the Provincial Congress sends Gerry as one of the delegates to the Continental Congress. So he is there in July of 1776 when Congress votes for independence. He doesn't sign the Declaration then. This is a much later painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It didn't happen like this. And Gerry is seated right here. John Trumbull, the artist who did this painting around 1818, was very careful to put in the actual people who were part of this Congress. And so there is Gerry sitting beside Robert Treat Paine, is another of the Massachusetts delegates. And he does sign the Declaration sometime in August of 1776. He really is a tireless worker when he's in a legislative body, whether it is the Massachusetts Assembly or the Provincial Congress or the Continental Congress, or later the Constitutional Convention, and later still the Congress of the United States. And he is someone that other delegates come to like in most cases. In this first Congress, he develops a lifelong friendship with John Adams and also with Abigail Adams. There's a story about Gerry after the first Congress. He knew Samuel Adams from his time in the Massachusetts Assembly. By the way, he also knew Thomas Jefferson. He'd met Jefferson on a visit to New York in 1764. And John Adams had bought some tea in Philadelphia that he wanted to send home to his wife, Abigail. And Gerry was on his way home before Adams was. So Adams entrusted the tea to Gerry, who brought it to Boston, and he got a little confused. He actually delivered it to Mrs. Samuel Adams instead of Mrs. John Adams. But notwithstanding, does this still happen with Congress? You send things home with, So Abigail Adams really takes a liking to Gerry. They're the same age. Her husband is slightly older than he is. And she keeps trying to marry him off, trying to find he's now in his 30s, and she wants him to get married. And he writes her long letters explaining the virtues of bachelorhood, defending bachelorhood against Mrs. Adams, who thinks he should be properly married and making some lucky woman happy. There's also a story about the signing of the Declaration, which may or may not be apocryphal. Gerry was a fairly slight man, and Benjamin Harrison, delegate from Virginia, was quite a heavy man. And you probably know the famous line that Benjamin Franklin may or may not have said, that we must all hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately. And Harrison said, well, if we do hang, Gerry, I'll have an easier time of it than you. So after this, he continues serving in the Congress until about 1779. And during this time, he's able to work with Diego de Goqui to have Spain supply the Americans, because Gerry serves on the Board of Treasury as well as the Board of War. These are the two most active and most difficult committees to be on. You're one overseeing the army and the other overseeing how to pay the army. And he really is tireless. Between August of 1777, when Congress first starts recalling its roll calls, and 1787, when the Congress goes out of business, there actually are more motions which result in a roll call made by Elbridge Gerry than by any other member of Congress. Something like 115 motions, things moved by Mr. Gerry that Congress then votes upon. The next highest number is 43. And that's two members of Congress tie with 43 each. So think about this. He is one constantly making motions to do things, to advance things. And this is notwithstanding the fact that for about 3 of these years, he is out of Congress, a technical issue in which he feels Congress has not only disrespected him, but disrespected Massachusetts. And so Gerry, even though he is one of Massachusetts' delegates to Congress, simply stays away. He has a certain pride which bristles at being restrained by even as elegant and refined a body as the Congress. In addition to his pride, he also has a certain fear of you're creating an army. He fears creating a military dictatorship. The army is the one organization that seems to be, well, Congress, and I say this with some hesitation since we do have, there may be other people here who have a connection with the Congress. Congress is not an effective organization in the 1770s and 1780s. The army is. And Gerry fears that ultimately this army might take power, as had happened in other revolutions or other wars in which a general leads troops who then, of course, have the means to take power. And he fears that this might happen with the Continental Army. So he has a real fear of the military establishing power. He also has a real fear of someone thinking, why don't I become king of this collection of citizens who don't really know how to govern themselves. He really thinks that the ideal would be a government run by men of virtue, and the alternatives hadn't really been arrived at yet. How do you create a government of the virtuous? Or how do you ensure that men of merit rise to positions of power? Otherwise, he knows we are susceptible to military tyranny or to demagogues. John Hancock, for example, he never really trusted. Hancock, he thought, is a demagogue, a rich guy who pretends to be a friend of the people. And he knows that's really a dangerous fantasy to have. And my apologies to anyone here who's a rich person pretending to be a friend of the people. So as I said, he does have a certain friendship with some like-minded folks, like the Adamses, John and Abigail, Samuel Adams, who also have this idea of a republic governed by the virtuous, but how do you ensure that the virtuous are in positions of power? we still are working on that particular problem. In 1786, when he is back in Congress, which is now meeting in New York, he meets Anne Thompson, who is reputed to be the most beautiful woman in all of America. This is a portrait later in life, and I can't dispute it. This is here, she is much later in life. She's 20 years old, and he is about 41. Her father is also one of the wealthiest men in America, and Gerry, who just had spent some years writing to Abigail about the virtues of bachelorhood, does propose to Miss Thompson, and they marry at Trinity Church. It's an Anglican ceremony. Trinity was an Anglican church. And one thing becomes very clear when he and his bride come back to Marblehead. She was used to kind of a more refined society in New York, and Marblehead, and her husband was still involved in the family business, which is shipping codfish, and it didn't really suit Mrs. Gerry, so they wind up moving to Cambridge. They buy a house that had been the home of Thomas Oliver, the lieutenant governor, who remained loyal to the crown, and this is one of the houses on Brattle Street, currently then called Tory Row, that was confiscated by the Massachusetts legislature because these folks were loyal and had left. And the Gerrys buy it and move in. Later on, it is called Elmwood. After Gerry dies, it is sold to the Lowell family. James Russell Lowell, the poet, is born in the house, lives in the house for his entire life, and calls it Elmwood, which I suppose is a more elegant name than the old Oliver Gerry house. And it currently is actually the official residence of the president of Harvard. So the Gerrys moved to this much more elegant house than the one that's up the street from us, and lived there for, the rest of Gerry's life. So he's returned to domestic life, or he's come to domestic life. He's in his early 40s. He's married a beautiful woman. They're beginning to raise a family. In fact, they'll have either 11 or 13 children over the course of their marriage. And so you would think this would be enough for anyone. However, in 1787, he is elected to the Constitutional Convention. One thing that really triggers him to get back into public life is Shay's Rebellion in December, January, February of 1786-87. Rebels in western Massachusetts, upset with the state legislature raising taxes, try to shut down courts in western Massachusetts that are hearing cases involving non-payment of taxes and non-payment of debt and other things. This taking power into their own hands, and this rising of the mob terrifies a lot of people, including Elbridge Gerry. He had not gone to the Annapolis meeting the previous year trying to figure out a way to solve the problems of the Confederation, because as I said, he was recently married, and who would want to leave the bliss of Cambridge for Annapolis. However, he does go to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, and he is also one of the most active members there. In fact, someone who did tabulate this said he was the 6th most talkative member of this convention, behind people like Gouverneur Morris, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and others. And he sees the need to change the system as it existed, the system of the Confederation. And he's against some things that we may find curious. He's against direct election of representatives, because he says, I won't be governed by the prejudices of the people. Thinking how in a direct you're going to have demagogues like Hancock. He also is afraid that people with landed property are going to oppress the merchants. Again, his family are merchants, and the people of Marblehead are fishermen and merchants, and they are generating real wealth. People with landed property see things differently, that real wealth is in land. And so he's against having anyone having this kind the landholders, he's afraid, are going to pass laws that are going to hurt trade. And he also fights against Hamilton and James Wilson on the idea of giving the judiciary a veto or review of laws. that is, you should have laws made by the people's representatives. He has some questions about how the people's representatives will be chosen. And he thinks that the executive should have this power rather than the courts. He also, as I said, he sees change as necessary, but he also is insisting that we have to retain some of the federal features, that is, the states having power as opposed to a central government having power. And that's the big dilemma. I could actually spend the rest of the week talking about the Constitutional Convention, but I know you have lives to get back to. The first half of the convention is really about drawing the line between how do you keep the states represented as entities versus should states with a bigger population have more power? And of course, states that had a bigger population, notably Virginia, Pennsylvania, even Massachusetts, tended to think bigger states should have more power than the smaller states. It's the smaller states that won't let us get anything done. The real nationalists at the convention, like Hamilton, Madison, Gouverneur Morris, want to have a national government. Representatives of the states think, well, in the states, the people are able to check the government. They have a stronger say in the states. If you have a central government, who will control it? And they want the states to retain a role. This is a big argument that takes up about half of the convention. Ultimately, it is resolved in early July when the Congress, realizing we're at an impasse, this whole thing is going to break down over this question. We're going to have a two-house legislature. In each house, the representation will be by population, which means Virginia is going to have more votes than Delaware or Maryland or New Jersey. And Virginia was the biggest state at the time. What happens is the convention does appoint a committee, and they keep the nationalists off of the committee. So instead of Gouverneur Morris or James Wilson, the real nationalists from Pennsylvania, their member of the committee is Benjamin Franklin. And from Massachusetts, instead of Rufus King or Caleb Strong, the representative is Elbridge Gerry, who chairs the committee, works out a compromise. One house of the national or federal legislature will represent the states. Each state will have an equal number of votes. Each state, in fact, will have 2 votes. The other house, the states will be represented by population. So it really is, partially thanks to Gerry, this is a sketch of the convention, that they will work out this compromise between the large states, the small states, and create the Senate, a body in which the states are represented as states, each one having the same number of votes, and the other house, the House of Representatives, does represent population. By the way, the artist who did this, he was actually a cartoonist, is the same fellow who did the Gerrymander in 1812. This is an 1824 sketch of the convention. Gerry had feared that if they didn't resolve this problem over representation, we will not only disappoint America, but the rest of the world. Imagine if the convention had failed to come up with a solution to this problem and had not worked out a way to create a government for these 13 states. And the proposal that Gerry and his committee brought to the convention passed by a vote of 5 to 4. Each state has 1 vote. 5 states voted for it, 4 states voted against it. Massachusetts was divided, so didn't cast a vote. Gerry and Strong were for it, King and Gorham were against it. So he is really an important member of this convention, helping to work out the most important compromise that they do during the summer. And then, having accomplished that, as the convention begins the process of drawing up a report on everything they had decided upon, he goes to New York to visit Anne, and when he comes back, the Committee of Detail has finished its work, and it has a draft of the Constitution ready. And Gerry looks at it and he realizes he can't support it because it does what he fears. It gives this central government too much power. And he really fears a centralization of power. And he raises objections. He has specific objections. A 6-year term for senators was too long. The House according to the draft, says, will from time to time publish its journals. What does from time to time mean? And can you trust members of the House to publish their journals in a timely fashion? He's distrustful of anyone with power, even the Congress. The 3/5 clause, he thought, gave the slaveholding states too much power. That is, they could have representation for their enslaved population, which couldn't vote. And he also thought that the Commerce Clause, under which Congress will have the power to regulate commerce among the states, that gives Congress the power to establish monopolies. And he also thought the office of vice president was a really dangerous blending of executive and legislative power. That is, you have this person who is elected as part of the executive branch, but then his job is presiding over one of the legislative branches. And for Gerry, as for many other of the Republicans of the 18th century, this blending of powers was really a dangerous thing. And then there were three major clauses which he thought rendered the rights of citizens insecure. The necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8. This is Congress will have all powers. You know, Article 1, Section 8 is a specific list of powers the Congress has, and then it says all powers necessary and proper to carry these powers into effect. Well, who decides what is necessary or proper? It's the Congress. So they are the ones deciding what powers they have. He thought that was a dangerous thing. He also thought there's no prohibition on Congress establishing a standing army. There is a thing that military appropriations can only be for a term of 2 years, and also no guarantee of trial by jury in civil cases. He's afraid of, so he doesn't like the centralization of power. Another thing he doesn't, well, he does say in the last days of the convention, he also says we should draw up a Bill of Rights. And at this time, the members of the convention, having been there the entire summer, don't want to spend any more time on a Bill of Rights. And Gerry, on the last day of the convention, says there's a civil war brewing in Massachusetts between the supporters of democracy, which he says is the worst of all political evils, and their opponents who are just as bad. I keep waiting for someone. Imagine if that tweet went out. Gerry says democracy is the worst of all political evils. He wouldn't have a chance today, but the camera's not on, is it? So I can say he's right. He's afraid of the mob. He's also afraid of the aristocracy who want to crush the mob. And he said this Constitution is just going to make this political argument in Massachusetts worse. Then he comes home to Massachusetts, and he does write his objections to the Constitution. This book is not it. For a long time, it was thought that the observations on the Constitution written by the Columbian Patriot were written by Elbridge Gerry. It's published anonymously, bless you, in February of 1788. Until the 1930s, people thought Gerry had written it. However, it turns out it was written by Mercy Otis Warren, a friend of Abigail's, who's also a friend of Elbridge Gerry's, and she is much more of a vociferous opponent of the Constitution than he is. By the way, Gerry objected to the term anti-federalist given to the opponents of the Constitution because the opponents of the Constitution feared it centralized power and destroyed the federal system. They wanted a federal system, and they insisted the Constitution creates a national system. So he said, we are the real Federalists, but the Federalists, those whom we will call the Federalists just to avoid confusion, are really anti-Federalists. We're the true Federalists. He said, instead of that, the real issue isn't between federalism and anti-federalism, it's between ratifying the Constitution and not ratifying the Constitution. So the two sides should be called the rats and the anti-rats. And he definitely was an anti-rat. Nonetheless, and by the way, the Federalists in Massachusetts, or as he might have called them, the rats, insist that he is really a traitor. He is not going along with their idea of centralizing power and so on. So they call him a traitor, say all kinds of nasty things. And by the way, if you think the tone of politics is negative and personal today, you probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in the 1780s and 90s. And we'll get to a few of these things in a bit. when the Constitution is ratified, when 9 states do ratify it, Gerry feels duty-bound to support it, as do most of the other opponents. Okay, we made our point clear that we didn't like the system. However, now it has been created, and people have voted for it. So we're duty-bound to support it. And so he accepts the nomination to be a member of Congress from Middlesex County, and there he goes in 1788 to be, and he is the second most active member of the first Congress. The first most is James Madison. Madison, of course, proposes the Bill of Rights. Madison thought, initially he thought a Bill of Rights was unnecessary and a mistake, and when Madison then rises in Congress, after they'd established the offices of the executive branch and created a judiciary, he said, well, now the opponents of the Constitution had insisted there needs to be a Bill of Rights, and now it's time for us to discuss a Bill of Rights. Gerry said, no, this isn't the time to discuss a Bill of Rights. He opposes the motion. It's this kind of back and forth, the fact that Gerry is in the middle on things and expresses himself, that led some even of his allies to think he was kind of erratic, or one 20th century historian thought he was schizophrenic, because he would say, we need a Bill of Rights, and then when Madison says, let's propose a Bill of Rights, he says, no, there's no need to do that. He is, though, ultimately a supporter of Alexander Hamilton's plan for a bank and to assume the state debts. By the way, one of the popular in the early 20th century arguments for the Constitution, Charles Beard, a historian in the early 20th century, said the Constitution was really a ploy by people who had invested in paper securities to make sure the government would pay them back. Gerry was one of the largest investors in paper securities, but he opposed ratifying the Constitution, which seems to shoot Professor Beard's theory down. Well, I don't know if we need to talk about Professor Beard. Has anyone heard of Beard before? Oh yeah, people are nodding. We knew Beard. Well, now I can tell you who was wrong. Good. So Gerry is a supporter of Hamilton's program because he thinks, okay, now we've created the system, we should have a national bank, which Madison opposed, and we also should assume the state debts, which Madison also opposed. And despite the fact that in Congress, he really is an independent voice, he is supporting the Federalist program, but the real Federalists here still hate him. George Cabot, who becomes one of the first senators from Massachusetts, is really, he thinks Gerry is too independent-minded. And at a dinner party in 1795, Cabot attacks Gerry as being a traitor, being the other nasty things, and gets so vituperative that Vice President Adams, who happens to be there, comes to Gerry's defense and says that Gerry's reputation and service are inferior to that of no other man in Massachusetts except Samuel Adams. And then, as I said, as you know, Adams becomes president in 1797, and for Adams, the big issue was the war with France. France was upset that the United States had made a treaty with England, and France was at war with England. And so France started seizing American ships. And France, of course, was undergoing a revolution, and this divided the Federalists and the Republicans in the 1790s, with the Federalists tending to see the French Revolution as an attack on all stability and all order, the Republicans seeing the French Revolution as a vindication of the rights of man. And now France is at war with the United States. President Adams, one of the first things he wants to do is send ministers to France to try to patch things up, because he knows a real war with France would be a bad thing. And he sends along he sends along 3 ministers. Anyone know who they were? Well, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who was a South Carolinian, who had been the minister to France first, but the French government sent him home. They said they didn't want Pinckney because he was too much of a Federalist. The other is John Marshall, senator from Virginia. And the third is Elbridge Gerry. He has 2 Federalists, 1 independent Republican from Massachusetts, and the real reason Gerry is there is because Adams knows the French distrust the Federalists. They think, but actually the guy that Adams first wanted to send was Thomas Jefferson, who was the vice president and the leader of the opposition to the Adams administration. And the Federalists in Adams's cabinet offered to resign if he sends Jefferson. And then his second choice, when Jefferson turns him down, is James Madison. This would be tantamount today to the president of one party sending an envoy from the other party, which might be a wise move, but it also would really infuriate his party. Gerry, Adams, Jefferson don't believe in parties as a virtuous thing. They see them, and Washington, for that matter, also didn't do that, yet parties are being developed. So anyway, Gerry goes on this mission to France, which is something of a disaster, and it begins with 3 individuals sent by Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, to say that before you see Mr. Talleyrand, you're going to have to pay us, and Mr. Talleyrand is going to demand a hefty bribe to do any business with the United States. And this prompts Charles Cotesworth Pinckney to say, when he's asked how much is the United States going to give as a bribe, he says not a sixpence. And it becomes the great rallying cry, millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. And then Pinckney and Marshall head home. Gerry stays. One reason he stays is Talleyrand won't give him his passport, so he really can't travel. Another reason he stays is Talleyrand really wants to have someone he can talk to, and Gerry fears if he leaves, then there will be an open war with France. Talleyrand also knows that if the United States goes to war with France, the United States is going to wind up supporting Great Britain, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he wants to keep Gerry there so he has an avenue of communication with the American administration. And so Gerry stays in Paris, and the Federalists at home think he's staying there because he is a dupe of Talleyrand and the French court. And in fact, some Cambridge folks, it's hard to believe Cambridge people would do this today. They set up a guillotine on Gerry's front lawn, and a bloody guillotine, I should say. And in fact, Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State, says that if Talleyrand would guillotine Mr. Gerry, they would do a favor to this country. And Gerry does write back to President Adams talking about Talleyrand really does seem sincere in wanting peace, and most of the Federalists, like Pickering, say Gerry is making this up. And Gerry ultimately does come home, and he does write a report for President Adams explaining his conversations with Talleyrand, and that there should be another ministry sent to France. By the way, at this time, the Adams administration had responded to the French and to this opening breach with creating a provisional army of 10,000 men that was going to fight the French if they did invade. And George Washington came out of retirement to command this provisional army. Before he did, Alexander Hamilton persuaded him, only take the job if I am second in command. So Washington tells Adams, oh, I'll only take the job if Hamilton is second in command, which means, in effect, Hamilton will be running the army. Adams fears that what Hamilton wants to do is establish himself as head of this army so that he can seize power. And another thing they do, of course, is pass a series of laws to restrict the Republican press, the Sedition Act of 1798. So if you write, utter, or publish, or cause to be written, uttered, or published, something that brings the president or a member of Congress into contempt, hatred, or ridicule, you can be sent to jail for a year and fined $10,000. I don't know how many of you are going to heap contempt on the president in those terms. So then actually there are going to be 2 elections for Congress in which it is against the law to say anything that might bring your opponent into contempt, hatred, or ridicule. And also the 2 alien acts, that the president can deport aliens from countries that are hostile to the United States, meaning France, or countries at peace with the United States who are deemed to be dangerous. So the Alien Friends Act, the Sedition Act, and the Provisional Army seem to be ways of keeping things in check. And Gerry now is saying, well, the French really want peace. Pickering insists that he be allowed to write the introduction to Gerry's report. A series of meetings between President Adams and Secretary of State Pickering, which Pickering shows Adams his report, and it basically says that Gerry is lying, and Gerry is a dupe, and the French really want war, and Adams keeps crossing out these paragraphs, and before finally he sends it off himself. And then Gerry, as I said, comes home, and the fact that he does not live too far from President Adams' home in Quincy means he can visit with President Adams, who's an old friend, and convinces him that there's a sincere desire by the French government now for peace. And Adams also fears that the real objective of Hamilton and Pickering is not fighting the French, but seizing power in the United States, a military coup d'etat with Hamilton at the head of it. Again, I don't know if this was in the musical about Hamilton's role in trying to establish himself as king in 1800. Adams certainly thinks it is. And he comes home and President Adams does agree to, sends a new envoy to France, and the two countries do make peace in October of 1800, which is such a signal achievement for President Adams that he calls his estate in Quincy Peacefield. So, this is all what's happening in 1800. And then, of course, the Republicans in Massachusetts see an opportunity of Elbridge Gerry is now home, and he is someone we should run for governor. And he does run for governor in 1800. He's a Republican, but he doesn't think parties are a big thing, so they call themselves the Constitutional Federalists. That is, we now support the Constitution, but also the system of federalism. And 1800, of course, is the year when Adams loses to Thomas Jefferson. By the way, President Adams endorses Elbridge Gerry for governor in Massachusetts. Gerry endorses President Adams. It's also worth noting that in 1796, Gerry had been a presidential elector and had voted for John Adams. And then in 1804, as a presidential elector, he votes for Thomas Jefferson. These two guys seem to stand at the top of opposite political parties. Gerry supports both of them, and each one of them sees, Adams and Jefferson both see themselves as being above parties. Gerry defeated Caleb Strong in the election of 1800. Something like 39,000 votes were cast, and the margin is about 2,600. It's the first time Eastern Massachusetts goes for the Republicans. And in fact, Gerry is the first Republican to carry Boston in the election of 1800. And then the Republicans run him again in 1801, 1802, 1803, again, unsuccessfully. Massachusetts remains a Federalist state. But Gerry sees the Republic is safe with Jefferson in power. And meantime, instead of politics, he's focusing on the family finances. He was a very astute businessman. His brother, Samuel Russell Gerry, I don't know, are there any descendants here of Samuel Russell Gerry? In the 1790s, Elbridge Gerry had persuaded President Adams to appoint his brother Samuel to be the customs collector here in Salem. I'm sorry, boy, I know there's probably not a worse faux pas that you can do than being in Marblehead and saying here in Salem, so I apologize. And let's rewind the tape. Samuel Russell Gerry is the customs collector in Marblehead, and he's not very good with money. And he winds up very heavily in debt. And at some point, his brother Elbridge, who is a better businessman, co-signs a note for his brother Samuel. And his brother Samuel is also he's the collector of customs. So there's a lot of money coming through. He can borrow from this and pay it back later. Well, the later never really comes. So his brother Elbridge has co-signed a note for him. Someone has to pay. And of course, it is going to be Elbridge, who's been buying property, otherwise investing wisely. And so Elbridge Gerry winds up heavily in debt in the early 1800s. By 1810, he's been paying it off, but he's still about $66,800 in debt to the government in 1810. And that's the year he is elected governor of Massachusetts. He is actually defeats Christopher Gore, who had been governor. This is Christopher Gore. And his first administration he's quite conciliatory. Again, he wants to govern without parties and reconcile these divergent interests. And then in 1811, the war is really heating up, potential war with England. Gerry thinks that the Federalists, the Essex junto and others, are really too much tied to the British interest and that they would betray their country rather than break with England. So his second term, he's reelected. In those days, governors served a one-year term. And in his second term, he sees the Federalists as really pushing these monarchical plans. You'll recall President Adams fearing that Hamilton was pushing monarchical plans and so on. So he becomes much more of a Republican in his second term as opposed to being against the Federalists. And it's that term that gives us the Gerrymander in January of 1812. And then in April of 1812, he is defeated for re-election. And then in June, he's nominated for vice president. James Madison has the distinction of having two vice presidents who die in office under him. And he learns of his nomination for vice president in June of 1812, the same time he learns that the United States has declared war on England. And then he and Madison are elected in the elections of 1812. And Gerry takes the oath of office actually at Elmwood in Cambridge. And then he sets out for Washington. And he gets into the carriage on his way to Washington. And the only other person waiting for the carriage to Washington is Timothy Pickering, who's been elected to Congress. This is a guy that Gerry has clashed with and actually been quite openly enemies with. And here the two guys have to share this long carriage ride down to Washington. Even worse, when they get to an inn, the inn only has one room available. And the room only has one bed. So these two guys have to share the bed. And this becomes quite a story, of course. You can imagine, you can probably put in your head different people today, see them sharing a bed. And President Adams, who's now in retirement, writes to Gerry, "There are pretty stories universally circulating here of your fortuitous journey in the stage with Colonel Pickering. I've heard them with pleasure, for they really do honor to both. They really are good-natured. The millennium," Adams says, "seems to be commenced. The wolf has really dwelled with the lamb," citing Isaiah 11:6. And Pickering, commenting on these stories, says he doesn't know which was the wolf and which the lamb, but they did share a bed. And Gerry does go to Washington to attend to his duties as vice president, and it's actually his salary as vice president that allows him to pay off his debt, which is certainly a good thing. At the end of the congressional session in 1813, this is Gerry as vice president. By the way, the map of the Gerrymander, I'll just flip back to it briefly. I apologize for this. It was said that not only does it look like a serpent, but it was also said that the artist made to look like Gerry's profile. So he is vice president, and as I said, the vice president presides over the Senate, and that actually is the only constitutional responsibility of the vice president, to preside over the Senate. It's, Gerry has the distinction of being the only vice president who had opposed creating the office in the first place. And in September of 1812, he returns to a capital that had been burned. In September of 1812, the British burned Washington in retaliation for the Americans having burned York in Ontario. And so the Capitol building is burned. The Senate chamber they're able to use. The House is meeting in another building. President Madison is living in a rented place. And the 22nd of November, the Senate debates this new military act, creating a professional military force. This is in the midst of a war. We've just had the Capitol burned. We don't know the war is going to end in January. And the Senate is also debating creating a Navy. And you may recall that Gerry, in the spring of 1775, had proposed that Massachusetts start raising a naval force. And Gerry is the one who knows John Glover, who's the one who sells a ship to Washington to start a continental navy. But Gerry and Glover understood the importance of sea power when, of course, Washington comes to understand it. And so here is Gerry in Congress presiding over the Senate. And by the way, the governor of Massachusetts, Governor Caleb Strong, opposed having Massachusetts troops leave the state. He thought the war was unconstitutional, and he thought Madison was going to be replaced. In fact, there was a story that John Marshall thought that maybe Madison should resign and have the Senate make Rufus King president because Madison was so inept. It's really hard to believe a time when people would say bad things about the president like this, that someone else should take his place because we don't like him. And Senator Gore, the senator from Massachusetts, the guy that Gerry had defeated for governor in 1810, is against the whole idea of conscription. They see this as next, that not only will we have the militia being called out of the state to fight this unconstitutional war, but men are going to be conscripted into the armed services to create a standing army for Madison. Think about this day when Gerry is hearing some of these central themes of his life, the fear of military power and the fear of monarchical power here, as he is now on the side of, well, the administration wants to raise a military force because they see this as a necessity. Is conflicted, I would suppose. So that night, he does tell his landlady at the inn that he doesn't feel well that night. And the next morning, he again, complains of chest pains and does drink his breakfast cup of chocolate, and then he gets into a carriage and goes to the Capitol. He'd been talking about Massachusetts politics, which, if you have chest pains, is probably never a good thing to begin doing, and has the carriage turn around because he's not up to presiding over the Senate that day. Gets back to the boarding house. The doorman says, "Are you ill?" And he says, "Yes." And they carry him upstairs, lay him in bed, and a few minutes later, he dies. The next day in the Senate, quite shocked with this, Senator Gore from Massachusetts, the same guy that Gerry had defeated for governor 3 years earlier, moves that till the end of this term, Gerry's salary should be paid to his widow. The Senate doesn't go along with that. But here you see people on the other side trying to reconcile this somehow. And Gerry is buried in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington. The family couldn't afford to bring him back. The family is still in debt. They've paid off their debt to the United States, and they've sold most of their property, but they don't have the wherewithal to bring the body back, have him buried in Cambridge or in Marblehead. So Congress does bury him in the Congressional Cemetery. He's the only signer of the Declaration of Independence buried in Washington. And in fact, Anne Gerry is the longest lived widow of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. She dies in 1849. And here is his tomb at the Congressional Cemetery. And inscribed on it, the Senate had picked this quote of Gerry's that they thought really exemplified his life. Say, the fact that he died as he was on his way to his duties at the Senate. It is the duty of every citizen, though he may have but one day to live, to devote that day to the good of his country. It was a recognition that over his long life, that's what Gerry had done, devoting himself to his community here in Marblehead or in Cambridge, or to the Commonwealth which he had helped to restore in the 1770s, and ultimately the nation that he helped to found.